I'm Rob Dansman, and this is The Better Semester, where I provide insight and actionable advice to parents of college students. I'm a nationally certified counselor and licensed clinical mental health counselor, specializing in work with college students and their parents to improve mental health, organization, and motivation. Today, I'm talking about weed and college students. I'm going over some basics and a lot of background, what weed usage looks like on campus from a clinical perspective, and most importantly, what can be done to treat use and abuse. The background, while pretty boring, has some important info that really is relevant for figuring out how best to treat substance use. I've put some additional information in this episode's show notes as well. You can also visit my blog at motivatecounseling.com. I also have a whole chapter in my first book, Insider's Guide to Parenting, How to Solve Messy Problems and Build a Great Family. You can find it on Amazon. Okay, let's talk about weed. Weed, though not necessarily the gateway drug that we were led to believe it was years ago, is nonetheless a consistently used drug and often what parents were most concerned with when college students are on campus. Fortunately, compared to other drugs on campus, weed is not nearly as bad as some other contenders. Its side effects are not nearly as severe or dangerous. That's not to say there aren't risks. The worst drugs, though, are way more dangerous and may surprise you. They are right in your bathroom cabinet, at the baseball practice, and in schools and dorm rooms. Prescription drugs are by far the biggest and scariest category of drug use, and it's only growing really, really fast. In a few weeks, I'll dedicate a whole future episode on prescription drugs, but for our purposes today, I'm sticking with weed. So let's head back, way back, to understand a bit of weed's history and how it presents today. In the U.S., increased restrictions and labeling of weed as harmful began in many states in 1906. Outright prohibitions began in the 1920s, and by the mid-1930s, weed was regulated as a drug in every state, including 35 states that adopted the Uniform State Narcotic Drug Act. The first national regulation was the Marijuana Tax Act of 1937. Weed was officially outlawed for any use, medical included, with the passage of the 1970 Controlled Substances Act, or CSA. Multiple efforts to reschedule weed under the CSA have failed, and the Supreme Court ruled that the federal government has a right to regulate and criminalize weed, even for medical purposes. Despite this, states and other jurisdictions have continued to implement policies that conflict with federal law, beginning with the passage of California's Proposition 215 in 1996. By 2016, a majority of states had legalized medical weed. And in 2012, the first two states, Colorado and Washington, legalized recreational use. So, what's the current state of use among college students? When college students use weed, there's an increased risk of reducing cognitive, memory, and learning functions. Weed also negatively impacts how the brain builds connections between the areas necessary for those functions. Short-term effects include dry mouth, short-term memory difficulties, red eyes, and delayed motor function. Weed is used by smoking, vaping, it's put in food, it's also used as an extract. As I stated above, more students are vaping weed than smoking. There's also a growing market for edibles, especially baked goods. 44% of college students reported using weed in the last 3 months, and 11% use almost daily. Next, I want to talk a little bit about the chemicals in weed and how they impact students. Tetrahydrocannabinol, or otherwise known as THC, is the active chemical that produces psychoactive experiences. THC is one of 483 known compounds found in marijuana, 65 of which are cannabinoids, a class of diverse chemical compounds that acts on cannabinoid receptors in cells that alter neurotransmitter release in the brain. Prior to the 1990s, THC concentration was less than 2%. During the 1990s, it grew to 4%. And between 1995 and 2015, there has been a 212% increase in THC content in the marijuana flower, which is the part that people smoke and turn into actual edibles and extracts. In 2017, the most popular strains found in dispensaries in places like Colorado had a range of THC content from 17 to 28%. The flower, or leaves, that are generally smoked or vaped are only one formulation. Producers now have concentrated THC products such as oil, shatter, dab, and edibles that have been able to get the THC concentrations upwards of 95%. There's absolutely no research that indicates this level of THC is beneficial for any medical condition. The purpose of these products is to produce a high, and the increased potency makes them potentially more dangerous and more likely to result ultimately in addiction. Don't let your kid try to convince you marijuana is risk-free, especially at these concentrations. While they are not likely to develop cancer or become an addict, there is significant research that shows a dramatic increase in car accidents while using weed. There is also loads of evidence that, as discussed earlier, memory, anxiety, and thinking is significantly compromised. Another symptom of weed use that's increased in the last few years is depersonalization. In general, weed-induced symptoms of depersonalization, and also referred to as derealization, are time-locked to the period of intoxication, peaking approximately 30 minutes after ingestion and subsiding within 120 minutes of exposure to the drug. However, among a subgroup of people who use weed, symptoms of depersonalization or derealization persist for weeks, months, and sometimes even years, even after discontinuation of smoking weed. Those who experience prolonged symptoms may have weed-induced depersonalization derealization disorder. The pathogenesis, or the way that this disorder develops, of weed-induced depersonalization derealization disorder can be marked by an initial dissociative disturbance with a severity that subsides but later returns in episodes that eventually becomes chronic. In other cases, onset can be more abrupt, with symptoms popping up during the first intoxication and persisting unremittingly for months or years. For other students, symptoms do not occur until hours or even days following the first weed use. Many students use weed to help them sleep at night. Research shows that weed is helpful for sleep in certain cases. For students with certain conditions such as chronic pain and PTSD, weed may help them fall asleep faster, wake up less during the night, and overall improve sleep quality. Many students use weed for insomnia, anxiety, and pain. Among these users, the effectiveness of weed for sleep is more ambivalent, though a study conducted on individuals with insomnia found that many participants reported relief from their symptoms when using weed. Many students use weed for anxiety too, especially those with social anxiety disorder. THC appears to decrease anxiety at lower doses and increase anxiety at higher doses. CBD appears to decrease anxiety at all doses that have been tested. CBD, by the way, is the second most prevalent active ingredient in cannabis or marijuana or weed. While CBD is an essential component of medical marijuana, it is derived directly from the hemp plant, which is a cousin of marijuana or weed. CBD does not cause a high by itself. The research also suggests that while short-term, low-dose use of weed decreases anxiety, long-term use increases anxiety. Now let's talk a little bit about weed and depression. Research suggests that students who use weed, especially regular or heavy users, are diagnosed with depression more often than students who don't use. However, it doesn't appear that weed directly causes depression. It's likely that the genetic, environmental, and other factors that trigger depression also lead to weed use. Some students with depression may use weed as a way to detach from their depressive symptoms. Heavy users may appear depressed as a result of the dulling effects of weed on feelings and emotions. There are also links between weed and other mental health conditions. Weed use may trigger schizophrenia or detachment from reality, also known as psychosis, in students who are at higher risk of psychosis. The symptoms of diagnosed psychotic illness may be aggravated, made worse by weed use as it continues. The bottom line is, weed and depression often accompany each other more often than parents may realize, but there's no clear evidence that weed directly causes depression. Now I want to talk a little bit about how students use weed. Many students mix weed with tobacco. They call this a spliff. The goal is to get more high or have it last longer. The research shows that this combo increases exposure to carbon monoxide from the nicotine in tobacco, resulting in higher THC inhalation per gram of weed. Weed can interact with other chemicals for nasty side effects too. Weed and alcohol. Weed use will likely increase the effects of alcohol on students. Next is weed and anticoagulants and antiplatelet drugs, herbs and supplements. These types of drugs, herbs and supplements, reduce blood clotting. Weed might change how the body processes them and possibly lead to increased risk of bleeding. Weed and central nervous system depressants. Weed use in combination with CNS depressants might increase the sedative effects of drugs like Ambien or tranquilizers. Weed and protease inhibitors or antiviral drugs. When used with these, weed might reduce their effectiveness. And finally, weed and SSRIs or selective serotonin reuptake inhibitors. Mixing weed with this type of antidepressant might increase the risk of mania. Now, before we talk about treatment options and how to get a college student to cut back on weed, it's important to understand a conceptual model called stages of change. I have a few links dropped in the show notes for this episode. This is one way clinicians help students prepare for and ultimately embrace changing their relationship with weed. This model is not exclusive to college students smoking weed and is used with many populations with different behavioral challenges. So I'm going to walk you through and explain the stages of change. In behavioral health, we use a model called stages of change to help identify a person's level of interest and commitment to changing a behavior. For our example here, it's drug use. Research on behavioral change has found that people move through a series of stages when changing their behavior. While the amount of time a person remains in each stage is different for each person, the tasks required to transcend to the next stage are not. Certain principles and steps of change work best at each stage to reduce resistance, facilitate progress, and prevent relapse. So what are we aiming for? Maybe sobriety? Maybe reasonable use doesn't inhibit decent grades. If things are severe enough, sobriety is probably what we're after. There's just something magical that happens around 5 years of being clean. After 12 months of continuous sobriety, 43% of individuals returned to regular smoking. It wasn't until 5 years of sobriety that the risk for relapse dropped down to 7%. Now, let me go through each of the stages of change for you. First one is pre-contemplative stage. People in the pre-contemplative stage are not even close to considering change. They do not intend to take action anytime soon, even though they might talk about getting clean someday. Being out of touch with the consequences of one's choices may cause a person to be in the pre-contemplative stage. Another factor could be a person that has multiple unsuccessful attempts at change, which leads to demoralization about his or her ability to change. Both the uninformed, underinformed, and unmotivated student tends to avoid considering the possible significant impact of their high-risk behaviors. They are often characterized in other theories as resistant or unmotivated or unready for help. The fact is, traditional outpatient and residential treatment programs were not designed to meet their needs. Next, the contemplative stage. I'll think about getting clean. Contemplation is the stage in which people intend to change, but just aren't quite there yet. Typically, professionals assume that if he or she states they are willing to change in the next few months, they are likely in contemplation stage or contemplative stage. People in this stage are likely to speak about or be more aware of the pros of changing, but are also aware of the cons to the degree that they will not make choices towards the change yet. This cost-benefit analysis of changing can produce profound ambivalence that can cause people to remain in this stage for months or sometimes even years. This state of stagnancy can be frustrating to loved ones who don't understand why someone who is aware of the benefits of changing does not actually just engage in it. Would-be clients in the contemplation stage are not ready for programs that expect participants to act immediately. Third, the preparation stage. Okay, I'm almost ready for change. Preparation stage is when people intend to take action in the immediate future, typically within the next few weeks. They have already taken some significant action in the past year, either by changing friends or classes or their major or some other part of their life they have control over. These individuals have a plan of action, or at least are open to someone's plan of action, such as going into treatment, or working with an outpatient therapist, or talking to a doctor, or maybe even something cheesy like buying a self-help book, or relying on a self-change approach. These actions may seem small to parents who are not in distress themselves, but are an important stage for those getting their minds wrapped around the idea of big changes in their life. At this stage, these clients are good candidates for treatment programs that require active engagement of participants. Next one, the action stage. The action stage is the phase where people have made specific changes in the last few months. They may make changes in their environment. For example, moving to a new dorm room, or maybe even something simple like painting their bedroom, or voluntarily enrolling in some type of therapeutic program. Some researchers and professionals do not believe that all modifications of behavior count as quote-unquote action in stages of change. As someone who has worked in the field for as long as I have, I know that any action, no matter how seemingly small or unrelated to sobriety, should be viewed as a positive thing. Next up, maintenance stage. Maintenance stage is the stage in which people have made specific changes to their behaviors and lifestyles with a clear dedication to prevent relapse. While in the maintenance stage, people are less tempted to relapse and grow increasingly more confident they can continue their sobriety no matter what challenges historically triggered drug use. Most substance use professionals see clients in the maintenance stage anywhere from 6 months to up to 5 years sometimes. The last one is the termination stage. Termination stage is when individuals are not tempted to use and demonstrate 100% internal locus of control. What I mean by that is they're willing to take full responsibility of all of their choices and all of the outcomes. This is the stage when you will not hear excuses about why your son or daughter couldn't get something done. No matter how depressed or anxious or bored or lonely or angry or stressed, students in this stage are sure they will not return to unhealthy habits, friends, or outdated coping skills. Some professionals believe there is no such thing as termination stage for someone with deep substance use issues, since they will always be in the maintenance stage. I'm on the fence with this one and prefer to not focus on the label of the degree to which someone is exercising self-control. Behavior is more important than category labels. If someone is sober and they want to stay sober, I judge their actions based on how they act to promote that healthier life. Most successful clients in recovery go through these stages about 3 or 4 times before they make it all the way through the cycle without relapsing. Understanding the degree to which your son or daughter is ready to change and get clean and change their life can be one of the most effective uses of working with a professional. As with many of the obstacles discussed, this is not a battle to fight alone. Okay, let's switch gears and talk about treatment. What can be done to help a college student overcome weed use? Most students I work with say they can stop using weed anytime they want. They just choose not to. But here's where the problem is. Having choice over whether they stop or not is not the best indicator of how weed is impacting grades, relationships, sleep, metabolism, and motivation. Students often need help well before they believe they do. Sometimes treatment might be part of an informal contract with their university, or maybe the court system, or parents if they get on academic probation or in legal trouble. Here are the different types of treatment options for college students when they are ready for help. In other episodes on the podcast, I go into detail about how to choose a therapist or choose a treatment program and understand the higher levels of care. But for today, I'm just listing out the options with a little less detail than those other episodes. To begin with, University Health Services. While most campus health centers and counseling and psychological services, or CAPS as I've referred to previously, do not provide specific substance use treatment, more and more universities are offering help along these lines. For example, the University of Central Florida is a good example of a school that has invested heavily in the mental health and substance use treatment for their students. Next, outpatient therapy with a licensed counselor with substance use experience. This is someone that is often in the local community that specializes in not only working with substance use issues, but also college students because of the unique developmental level they're at. If outpatient therapy isn't quite enough, we bump up to the next higher level of care, which is IOP or PHP. IOP stands for Intensive Outpatient Program. PHP stands for Partial Hospitalization Program. Intensive outpatient programs and partial hospitalization programs are outpatient treatment options that typically run a few hours each day during the week. This allows college students to remain at home or on campus while receiving treatment. It can sometimes be challenging to maintain a regular course load and participate in IOP or PHP, though many schools will be flexible if the student works with the disability services team. If those outpatient levels of care are just not enough, the college student may need to get a medical withdrawal and take a gap semester or maybe even a gap year. Here are the options for an even higher level of care: residential treatment. This is typically anywhere from the classic 28 days or 30 days to several months, depending on the severity of use and overlapping mental health challenges, also called comorbidity. There are many fantastic programs, though there are also lots of programs that are just plain garbage and prey upon naive and desperate parents and students. Part of my work with clients, when a higher level of care is clearly needed, is to help parents through the process of determining the quality and appropriateness of care. Next up, inpatient hospitalization. This is primarily for acute situations, like if a college student overdoses or has a severe accident related to substance use. This is a very short-term situation at the local hospital, normally anywhere from just a few hours up to 24, 48 hours, where they evaluate whether an additional level of care like residential treatment is necessary, and they will often refer out from there. Next, let's talk about drug testing. THC can be measured in blood, urine, hair, saliva, or even sweat for drug use testing, or forensic investigation of a traffic stop or a criminal offense of some sort. Concentrations obtained from analyses can be used to distinguish active use from passive exposure, elapsed time since use, and extent of duration of use. Many kids I work with, when a drug test comes back positive, swear they didn't smoke weed and that they simply were around friends that had. When parents want to confirm or rule out drug use, drug testing is a pretty reliable tool. Testing can be as simple as a quick instant urine test like the kind sold on Amazon or at CVS. It can be as complex as a lab analysis using mass spectrometry that takes several days for results. The results are unbiased, dispassionate data. I recommend drug testing to be used as a part of a larger treatment approach. If a college kid is back at home after bombing out freshman year, parents may want to have him working with a therapist for counseling, work with a psychiatrist for medication management, and confirm he's not using drugs through drug testing. Here's a quick list of how long THC is detectable in different types of screening tools. Within the urine, infrequent users, typically 7 to 10 days. Heavy users, anywhere from 30 to 100 days. Hair samples, up to 90 days. Blood, saliva samples, 2 to 3 days in the blood, up to 2 weeks in blood of heavy users. However, it depends on whether actual THC or THC metabolites are being tested for. Metabolites have a longer detection period, but THC is also detectable in saliva for 2 to 24 hours. Next, I want to talk about how to capture some of this within drug testing panels. The term panel refers to a drug or a family of drugs included in a drug test. For example, the panel, opiates, quote unquote, includes morphine, codeine, and heroin. The more panels a test includes, the greater the variety of drugs it tests for. Drug tests usually come as a 4-panel, 5-panel, 7-panel, 10-panel, 12-panel test. Generally, the biggest difference between the 4 and 5-panel drug test tends to be the elimination of weed as a tested substance. Some parents just don't care about weed showing up on a drug test. As I mentioned earlier, you could buy these at Amazon or CVS. If you're on Amazon, just search for drug testing or 5-panel or 7-panel drug tests, and it will quickly show up with many, many options. This is a way to save money by doing the drug testing at home. It can save you a ton. It typically costs anywhere from $30 to $50 per drug test if you send your kid to a lab. Labs will often use nearly identical drug testing equipment as you can buy on Amazon or at CVS. It's basically a plastic cup, a lid, and a dip test. Few therapists and mental health professionals do testing. If you do drug testing at home, here's some things to consider. First, make it random. Don't give your son or daughter a heads up you're going to test them. You don't want them to, quote unquote, accidentally schedule work or social plans when they're supposed to be at home. Next, make sure it's actually their urine that you're testing. Most clients I've worked with eventually ask, what's the best way to get someone else's pee? Kids find other people's pee. It's gross, but it happens. Urine should be at body temperature, about 98.6 degrees, and come directly from the body. Sounds obvious, but many parents don't think to confirm this. Labs will often offer a quote-unquote direct observation option if parents think their kid will try to sneak in a bottle of someone else's urine. Finally, DIY drug testing results are nearly instant. Don't let the kid escape after they fill the cup. Have them wait for results so it can be addressed immediately. In summary, weed, if addressed early on, doesn't have to ruin the semester. Though it's difficult for parents to remotely oversee weed consumption, it's not a bad idea to at least have some conversation around the deleterious effects. College students nearly always underestimate the impact and overestimate their ability to quit. Okay, everyone, I hope this helps you figure out the best way to help that college kid who may be struggling with weed. For more information about college student weed use and other information about drug use at college, check out my blog and sign up for my newsletter at motivatecounseling.com or check out my 2 books on Amazon. Just search for my name, Rob Dansman.